Michelle C. Johnson is a yoga teacher, social justice warrior, an intuitive healer, an empath, and she has over 20 years of experience in dismantling racism. We talk about feeling, deep heartbreak, resilience, and healing on a personal level and collectively. We're being called to rise up. Welcome, Michelle. It's good to have you here.
Thank you. Thanks for inviting me.
Oh, you're welcome. So, the Radical Recovery Summit started off really working at addiction and then getting into more trauma. We've always covered a broad range of topics, so not to be kind of constrained by addiction and trauma. But one of the reasons that I wanted to bring you into the summit, into this discussion, is your what you bring to the discussion. So you're a yoga teacher. You've
Mhm.
just published a beautiful book on finding refuge, working with grief, and you do a lot of anti-racism and equity work. So can you just talk a little bit about how you got into the work that you do? What brought you to this moment in time where you've written this book about grief and the collective grief that people are experiencing right now?
My dog Jasper is here. Um, and that's such a big question about how I got into the work or came to be in this particular moment. And often when people ask it, I answer in different ways depending on what feels most present and resonant at the time. As you mentioned, I'm a yoga teacher and have been teaching yoga since 2009, and went through my teacher training then, but practicing much longer than that. Um, I also am a clinical social worker, although am practicing more intuitive healing and not in a clinical practice now at this time, but did that for about 20 years, and have been leading anti-racism work for over 2 decades. And now doing a lot of work with grief. And sometimes people ask the question of how do all these things connect? And I feel like they connect because they're all related to wholeness and healing,
Mm,
understanding like systems of power and how we came to be in this moment and what we're doing to one another, and the ways in which we're not practicing collective care and need to lean into collective care, and also how spiritual practice invites us into remembering our interconnectedness and therefore how to practice collective care. um, and of course working with clients in my private practice, and in organizations and institutions for so long. A lot of what I was stewarding in those places and just in different spaces I held had to do with grief and had to do with loss and trauma and transition, and again, connected to individual losses, but of course, connected to the collective as well. And I think what led me to this moment where Finding Refuge came out in July, and it's really about individual grief and collective grief, is this sort of culmination of all of the work of like sitting in space and talking about our history and systems of oppression, in particular, specifically racism, is working with clients over time and seeing their transformation. But also, many of my clients, when they would come into a space, were showing up with deep grief, right? And as I named, trauma and loss of being alive on the planet as a Black person, having a lived experience in a white supremacy culture. And at a certain point, I was like, you are holding grief, stewarding grief. And I really wanted to normalize a conversation about grief because it's part of our human experience. And um, I feel like so much of what is happening right now, which is so many things are happening right now, but what is happening right now has to do with, uh, in part, the ways in which we haven't made space to grieve or process or feel or acknowledge, right? Some of the systems that I've named. And I think the other way that I answer this question of how I like came to be in this moment in this work is my birth story. I was born in 1975, and I was premature, 2 months early. I was 2 pounds and 3 ounces when I came out. I was losing oxygen, and so they did an emergency C-section, and I was taken to a different hospital because they didn't have a preemie unit. And so my mom was in a hospital. I was in a different one across town and didn't see her for 9 days in this like 2 pound, 3 ounce body, right? Trying to survive at that time. And I think about my birth story a lot because I learned more details of it later when I was writing my first book, Skill in Action, I asked my mother, and the way she told me made me really think about how I didn't want to come out, how I was losing oxygen, and how they had to pull me out and then moved me away from my mom. And so I feel like I came into the world, with this experience of having limited capacity to breathe, and came into the world having to like figure out how to survive without my mother for the first 9 days of my life, right? And without someone who loved me and cared for me, right? The healthcare professionals who handled me may have cared, but they weren't related to me, right? They didn't birth me, they didn't bring me into the world, they didn't manifest me. And so that's a different kind of relationship. And I think coming into the world in that way, and also often I'll say, I think I was like deciding, do I want to be in this space, right? And I'm really often struck by people's birth stories and then how that leads to what they do in the world, because so much of what I talk about is the breath and how the breath is life giving and how it's radical to breathe in a culture that does not want many of us to have space to breathe. So I think I got here because I was born into this space and had this experience of physically and energetically and emotionally not being able to breathe. And so much of my work is about making space to breathe. And that to me feels like healing work as well. So that's the other part of what I think I'll share about how I came to be in this moment. And lastly, I think my ancestors as well manifested me at this time in this way to do the work I do in the world, which is not it's not always easy to hold trauma and hold grief and find life, right, amid all of the trauma and grief. So that's a little bit about how I came to be.
Mhm. So the one of the things that is so prevalent right now, and we're really seeing everybody's nervous systems are pretty exhausted. There's a big need for rest and for action as well. And a lot of things have been really revealed through this last several couple of years with COVID and before that with Trump. So how would you approach or what would you want to say about the collective grieving and what we're seeing, and how can people work with that? I mean, this is a really hard thing to work with for you as a Black woman, and
Hmm.
and for other people as well. It's a really hard time. So how do we move from, and how does your practice support you in handling the world as it is, which is really hard right now?
Yeah. Um, when I was a child, I was pretty serious. And um, my mother would tell me every year in school when we had pictures. I just wrote a chapter about this for the next book. But every year when we'd have like our school pictures, I would go to have my picture taken and I wouldn't smile. And she would get the pictures and be like, Michelle, why didn't you smile? And I would say it was raining. Well, it didn't rain every year when it was picture day. She knew that. But I
Right.
think in reflecting on that, I felt the world in this way for a long time, like
Mm,
empathic, intuitive. Um, as a child, I felt like something was wrong. Like I didn't know what or how to articulate it. I didn't have the words I have now. And I knew something was misaligned. This is how I talk about it. Something was off, that we were disconnected, and I didn't understand why, that we
mm,
weren't talking to each other. I observed these things as a child and then internalized some of that and felt that and didn't know what to do with those feelings, right? Except to, not smile in the picture, like to be like, the world is not okay. I'm not
mm.
okay. Why are we smiling? I think that was like my child way of being like, can we pay attention? Something's going on. Can somebody tell me? So I think I've been this way for a long time. And while the world can feel heavy, or the way I relate to it, or the weight of what is happening, I also think it's a gift to be able to, from my perspective, which is just one, to be able to see and sense the truth about what's going on, and to invite people to expand their awareness and consciousness, and then to be called into action. Like, this is what I think I do in different ways, right? Different spaces I hold or facilitations. I'm really inviting people into consciousness raising, so that they can do something about what's happening on the planet. And we do that differently. Um, and you named, I mean, over the last almost 2 years, which has been the pandemic, so many of the patterns that were revealed through the beginning of the pandemic and the middle, although I don't know where we are in it now, right? I can never tell where we really are because we're not actually in control of it. But so many of the patterns, they're just not new, right? They were things that needed to be unearthed. And I wish it had not been in the way it happened. I mean, I wish something different and we would have paid attention before or something, right? It didn't, we wouldn't have to move through this experience of a global pandemic and loss that we've never in these incarnations experienced in our lives. Like this is not,
Hmm.
we've never seen this, felt this before, many of us. And to me, it's this like revelation and also this calling into collective care, and also this urgency around um, asking ourselves, what have we lost and why? And what's at risk? Like, what are we at risk, losing? And what do we need to change? And I think this is and many other questions COVID's actually asked us. But what I also say is, what I also say is that I don't think our nervous systems were designed to be in a sustained state of crisis.
Right.
And I think collectively, we've been in a sustained state of crisis for almost 2 years, and that people are like fatigued and they don't know how to plan their lives, and we don't know how to connect with each other. And there's this like containment that's showing up in a different way, or constraint maybe that's showing up. Like this is really going to shape how we relate to one another moving forward. But it's also a look back at how we've been relating to one another and like what needs to change about that. So they're the opportunities that I'm naming and the questions that have surfaced through COVID and Black Lives Matter, the resurgence of, and so many other things, global uprisings. And there's the cultural consciousness that has shifted because we've all moved through this experience of loss that we didn't anticipate. Like we could not have anticipated this as a collective. I mean, there were some indications something like COVID would happen, but I didn't know it was going to be like this. And for almost 2 years, like, and vaccines and all the stuff, just had no idea that this would be the one of the crises we would move through. Um, and part of what I do is, and I actually just led a 3 hour space circle online for holding grief, and really it was about witnessing and sharing and processing. So that's part of what I do in practice with people, is bring ritual into this space, is inviting people into their hearts, is inviting people to be authentic and vulnerable and be held in that. And as I named earlier, to normalize this experience of loss and grief. Although the amount of loss we've experienced through COVID, I don't think that's normal. What I mean is to like bring it up to the surface and speak about it with each other, because we're all moving through the same experience.
Right.
Um,
To, mm,
yeah, dominant culture wants us to act like we're not, and to get back to being productive and to pretend, which has caused so much dis-ease on our planet and for the planet, like as humans, our relationship with it. So I think I invite people back into, create a container that invites people back into wholeness, and building capacity to be with grief as a way of healing and finding freedom. That's what I would say about what I offer, and that shows up differently in different spaces. But a lot of that is contemplative practice, is reflecting, journaling, moving, breathing together, silence, right, holding the space together. And for myself, I because I'm such a big feeler, um, and I'm sort of used to feeling the weight of the world, I have a practice of prayer and meditation and engaging different divination tools, as a contemplative practice, journaling, movement. I have honeybees. I actually went out to see them earlier. I just saw them actually. Been out twice today to see them because of what I've been doing today. Like the
mhm.
natural world is a healing balm for me, and the honeybees are as well. So it's like watching them do what they do. They're bringing in pollen right now, even though it's December, but it's a little warm today. So those are some of the things: rest, connect with friends and circle and ritual. Some of the things I do to um, turn toward my heart and my heartbreak, and to hold the grief and to wade through it.
Hmm. So when you talk about collective care, that's not a term I've really heard.
Mhm.
Before we hear collective trauma, collective grief. So what would that look like? You've talked about some of those things just now. So if somebody is feeling really isolated, really affected, maybe they've lost somebody personally to COVID. Certainly, anyone who's aware of the racist culture that we live in, the woman hating culture we live in, there's so many things that are at play here. And people can feel so much despair and hopelessness. So, what are some of the practical things that people could do? You mentioned rest and
Mhm.
nature, and I love one of the things I wanted to point to in your book too is the prompts, the journal prompts. Can you just describe a little bit of what that might look like for someone?
Yeah. I'm glad you asked this question, because I think, one, we all grieve in different ways, even if we're having this shared experience of collective loss, and our individual losses, right? And not just people, again, transitions, relationships, how we thought life would be, like all of the different experiences we might have related to loss, and then making space to grieve. And I want to name that a couple things. One is that often when people think about making space for their grief, or allowing it to surface, or acknowledging that it's already there, like on the surface, often people feel afraid because of what will be revealed, uncovered, expressed. And that feels like I mean, I've encountered so many people who have that, like, I'm afraid to do it, right? I'm afraid to turn towards my heart. I'm afraid to move through the grief. I'd rather just act like it didn't happen. Or even if they want to acknowledge it happened, they don't know what to do with the emotions that surround it because it's so big.
Hmm.
And I just want to honor that that's like a real human experience to have. And I've had moments where the grief has felt like it's going to swallow me whole. And it didn't. Like, in looking back, it didn't, it hasn't. Um, and really, that came through for me, recognizing that my practice, my spiritual practice, which included movement and meditation and journaling and just being, right? Or being out in nature, and sometimes included connection, or chanting with others, or mantra work, like all of these different things, right? I recognized that my practice could hold that which I did not think I could hold. That's continued to be revealed to me as a lesson, like the practice, and I have a spiritual connection. So, and spirit can hold the things that I do not feel like I can hold, because really it's too much. There's like too much going on. So I just want to like say that's real. There's too much happening. We
There's
can't
too
hold it
much.
all,
Yeah.
and we need something that will hold us when we can't hold all the things that are happening. And that can look like, some of the things I named. It can, and often what I say is I invite people to begin with the heart, and to check in, how is my heart today, for 5 minutes, right? It can be time limited, because it also can overwhelm the nervous system, as you know, like people can become overwhelmed. But how does it feel to notice my heart, or that I have a heart, right? That's the beginning too. What emotions are present for me right now? I'm not my emotions, but what emotions are present? Right? Okay, there's joy, or ambivalence, or sadness, or confusion, or happiness. I'm cycling through these different emotions, right? I feel the full range of emotions. That's the human experience too. Um, People can do things that bring them pleasure, right? Even as they're wading through grief, remembering that they are allowed to feel pleasure. This is a big thing for people grieving, because often people feel like, if I move away from the despair and the sadness and the anger, or the whatever one might feel about a loss, or what they're moving through, what they're grieving, um, they feel like, if I feel pleasure, I'm not actually acknowledging what I've lost. That's not true, right? It's like, we can do so many things at the same time. I can acknowledge the grief and loss and also have moments of elation,
Mhm.
or humor, like laughter. This has happened multiple times, and I've witnessed this in people where it's like there's something going on that's traumatic, or there's a loss, or they're at a memorial service, and all of a sudden there's like a
It's a
emotional
birth.
release of laughter, right? Someone tells a story, someone realizes like something silly is going on, whatever it is. I've seen this so many and experienced it myself. So we can feel the full range of emotions. And I also think, I have a teacher who makes space for her grief, meaning she's holding grief all of the time, but once a month she like goes into her room, she tells everyone else they need to leave her alone for like 3 hours, and she puts on music that she knows will bring up emotion for her, like sadness, or just bring up, check, get her to check into her feelings is what she might say. And that's like her time where she makes space because she recognizes that there's grief and she's holding it. And other people like me, it's like every day I'm sitting in front of the altar. I am
Mhm.
checking in. I'm tuning in. I'm breathing. I'm noticing my body and my heart, and what I feel, and noticing what might need attention. That's a tool, a skill, right? Like, what needs attention right now? Can I meet that need now? If not, when can I meet it? What do I need? What resources? And then, all of the things we said: rest, connection with the outer world, with people, because grief can also make people narrow their perspective, when in fact, like, there's so much going on. And I think what's been healing for me is remembering my connection even as I'm grieving, instead of retreating in a way that takes me away from my connection with the world. There is retreating to preserve and like for self-preservation and care, and then there's retreat that's like, I don't want to feel my connection, or I've forgotten my connection to source or other beings. And grief can really do that, um, for folks, that create this experience of feeling limited in this way that makes us forget like our limitlessness. That so there's a lot more, but those are a few things I think people can use to begin this journey of being with their emotions and their human experience. And as we've said, part of that is being with grief.
Well, one of the things that you named was the loss of predictability. We didn't expect that our world was gonna change so quickly and so radically, and there seems to be lots of ways that we resist letting that in, and maybe pretending that it's gonna come back to normal, whatever that was, or we think it's not fair, people might get angry, so there's a lot of nervous system and primitive brain kind of responses, especially right now, what we're
Hmm.
seeing. So do you feel that everybody has the capacity to heal?
I do.
Yeah.
I do. I'm clear about that. Yes. And I feel like there's so much in the way of our healing, right? There's so much that there are barriers that we have created. There are barriers that we're sort of rooted in, but we didn't create, right? Like systems of oppression. I didn't create these systems, and yet I'm implicated in them in some way or being affected by them. Um, there are stories that I tell myself that sort of get in the way of my own healing. There are traumas and experiences that get in the way, or that create patterns,
Right.
that make it so that it's much harder to heal. Um, and I believe everyone can heal. Um, it's a journey though, and I don't know that everyone else believes everyone can heal, and that's probably part of the reason why we're where we are, or that everyone should be able to have what they need to heal, or that everyone actually is whole. We're not actually broken. Like, I don't believe we're broken. We have to remember our wholeness, which is a lot of work, to remember wholeness in the face of so many things telling us we're not whole, or trying to like split us apart, is what I always say, or fragment us. So yes. And that's one of my prayers is that we do heal collectively, because I don't think we can do it in isolation. I don't believe we can do this in isolation. I don't think we're meant to be isolated. Um, and I know that most of us come from, people that we're in community in some way, right? Like we're in circle in some way. I always think about this. We're in circle. We're engaging the elements. We're around the fire. We're in community cooking for one another, taking care of each other's families. I know a lot of other things happen, but way, way back when people were
Right.
in community.
Mhm.
Um, and so much of that has been, I mean, I've only grown up in the US, so much of what I've experienced here is a separation from community, which gets in the way of our healing.
It definitely does. Yeah. And other people are and can feel and truthfully are very much a threat. So in COVID, everybody's breath is a threat, but
Hmm.
also living in the culture that we live in, other people are a threat to us. Not everybody seems to be, or not everybody is wishing us well. Some people are violent, some people are entitled and narcissistic, and all the things that go on. So for people that are in families and communities where they're feeling not at home or not safe, what kind of um, what kind of journal prompts or what kind of practices might someone do to kind of reach out more into community and feel more connected with that others around them?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is tricky because of agency. Like some people um, don't have the resources or the agency to, the choices I get to make because of the access I have, the identities I embody that are in closer proximity to power, right? That gives me room to potentially to heal, because I might have more of what I need than someone who doesn't have just embody the same identities, is further away from power based on the identities they embody. So I'm clear that it's why I said like we don't all agree in the same way and we're not all being impacted in the same way. Like that's true because of these how we're positioned. So I just want to be clear about that. And to say that um connected to that, which you mentioned, like some people may be in spaces where they don't feel safe, right? And what can they do in those spaces? Um, and that often the identities we embody that are places in closer proximity to power allow us to feel more safe. I don't think the world is safe, but to feel more safe. But I'm not like living in a space that is a threat to me. For example, in my home, when I go out the door, it's a different thing. But when I'm in my home, I feel pretty safe and content. And I recognize that's not everyone's experience. And what I would say is that, if there is a practice of grounding, which might mean moving and breathing, or it might mean sitting and breathing, even if it's for a minute or 5 minutes, so that someone can come back into the breath and remember they're in a body and feel what's going on in the body, right? And for a moment, breathe and think about where do I have agency right now if I do it? I think that is a practice that people can use. In almost all most spaces, people can come into that practice if they know how to do that or led through that. Just to take a moment to be like, I'm in the body, because there's so much that moves us away from the body, and certainly a lack of safety will do that for folks. And connecting to community, we've had to, like, for 2 years, almost 2 years, I've been on Zoom, right? Like, and I know I have a computer and I can be on Zoom and all of that. And it's reconfigured how we connect. And I've had these profound experiences on Zoom in community while I'm looking at boxes, looking at people's faces, half their body, right? Like, it's like, but still, there's something magical that can happen. Um, so I do think there are creative ways we can connect, even if we feel isolated in our physical environment. Like, can we go out? Can we connect on our phone on Zoom? Can we reach out? Can we call in community, right? Can we call in that kind of energy, and invite that into our lives? I think those kind of practices can help as well. Can we ask our benevolent beings to support us? I also just wrote a chapter or a while ago about this isolation, and how even when people feel like they're alone, they're not alone. Like their spirit, their ancestors, And I don't just mean blood lineage, right? There are different kind of lineages that people have. There's the earth, right? There are the elements. So perhaps remembering that can also help people feel less isolated and alone, because I don't think we're ever alone. And I know what it's like to feel lonely and like I'm alone and the only person feeling whatever it is.
Hmm. Those are those can be difficult to access at times when people feel really isolated, and they're also really important as a practice that we can keep coming into a practice of connection, even if we
Hmm.
don't feel that. And in the old days, before the internet, you know, like as a lesbian, I moved to a big city where I could be out and I could find my people. And
Hmm.
and we can do that over online now. And so
Hmm.
that really is a huge difference. And I talk to people who are in all kinds of different support groups and just communities where they can connect with each other.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, there's so many different ways now.
There are, yeah, yeah. So as a yoga teacher and somebody who's involved in that world, one of the things that we are aware of at times that there's a lot of spiritual bypassing. People sometimes get into yoga and meditation um, to escape out of the misery of their lives. Um, what are your thoughts about that? Those practices are so good and so connecting, and yet they can also be disconnecting.
Yeah. Um, I was just thinking about this earlier when I led this session because someone asked a question that's similar to your question. And I think it's how we use the practice. And I don't mean use to consume. I mean, I think it's how we engage the practice.
Hmm.
Right. So there's a way I can practice the things I just named, as you named, as a way of escaping reality. And there's a way I can practice the things I named as a way of leaning into what's happening. And so, what's my intention for the practice? Is it to escape? Knowing there's a lot around me that wants me to escape this reality, meaning be distracted from it,
Right.
not feel it, not change it, right? If I'm distracted, I won't notice, I won't do anything about it, I won't really feel into the things we're talking about. So, I always think about practice, and in particular, my yoga practice, as a practice that calls me into leaning in. It, for me, is not about um, escaping to you know be in this illusion of feeling good. Like escape is not really, it's temporary, right? It's a moment of I get to make up this experience I'm having and feel like I'm gonna feel better, and that's fleeting. Like that's not the real, that's not what's going on, that's not the human experience. And so, and I'm sure I do, I mean, I'm sure I do that. Like sometimes I watch way too much TV that is not feeding my spirit at all because I'm like tired and I don't want to think.
Right.
Like I do that, right? And I'm like, I'm done, my brain's shutting off, I'm not actually gonna gonna engage. And when I'm like, oh, this is not feeding my spirit, then I'm like, you need to do something else that will. To have like enough awareness. Or if I'm like, well, I'm still gonna watch this ridiculous TV show, I'll be like, I'm making a conscious choice to escape right now because I don't want to engage. I'm like really clear with myself in those moments most of the time, like, this is what you're doing right now. Why are you doing it? What else might you need? What could you do? What are you trying to avoid? And so I would ask folks to really think about, why am I practicing whatever it is they're practicing? What's the purpose? What's the intention? What's my hope for the outcome of this practice? Not to be attached to outcomes, but that's more connected to intention.
Right.
Um, and to know where, in particular in yoga communities, because of it being a spiritual practice, there are so many ways we can use absolute truths to escape the relative truth in real time, what we've been talking about and what we're experiencing. So there's a like, people entering into these practices, I think, need to understand that um, because of capitalism and having met yoga and the sort of business part of that, and the wanting to only feel good things when we practice mainly asana, which is how people talk about yoga movement here, even
Hmm.
though we know it's much more than that. That people need to understand that's kind of the context. and that there are spaces that where people are allowed to show up as they are with all of their emotions, and spaces that will really call people into working with the practice in the way that I do. Like, let's lean in and move through what's really happening for us. And we may feel ease after we do that, right? It's not like the drudgery of life. Like, we may feel more ease and like, oh, I moved through that in my practice today. Or as I sat next to this person in meditation or online, right? Um, so, spiritual bypassing is so rampant in spiritual communities, and it's bypassing. I mean, it's reflective of the bypassing that dominant culture wants us to do, because it doesn't want us to change what's going on. Like,
Mm.
because dominance and superiority want to continue to maintain and build themselves. So the practices are deeply healing, and what I understand about healing is that it includes this practice of leaning in, right? That healing is not going to happen through avoidance, and it never has, and it never will. Like, we have so much evidence of that. So maybe we want to try something different, and again, shape our intention around the practice and be really clear.
That brings us nicely into, I think, what will probably be the last question before we have to finish. But you speak in your book and on your website about we're being guided to rise up. There's this collective experience of grief and heartbreak and disappointment and powerlessness and all of this social injustice. And then we're being guided to move into this moment. And it might be something as simple as, although it's not easy to do, but as simple as being in our own heart and feeling what we feel and being in our body. So, would you speak
Mhm.
about that a little bit? We're being guided to rise up. This moment requires something of us.
I think it's some of the questions I surfaced related to COVID and what's going on, and the what it's asking us to look at. And of course, I've made meaning of it. If we'd asked 10 people, they have different meanings. I'm really clear about that. Like, but it's in my experience, I usually make meaning of things that don't make any sense to me.
Mhm.
And I am a person who holds space for healing, and I feel like a person who is a truth teller and can also perhaps see some things or sense some things that others may not be able to see or sense, or remember. That's a different way of thinking about it. Like, I'm in a deep practice of remembering, which has been a process, and some folks um, may not be in that same kind of practice, so can't really feel like the urgency of what's going on or what really needs attention. I mean, we could look at any number of things that are happening right now that are guiding us to do something different. Like, I mentioned collective care, and you asked about it earlier, and I started to hear a lot about it. I talked about collective care for years, and then started to hear about it more when COVID began, and more people had mutual aid networks, which is not like a new thing, but more people were talking about it because we were having to like be isolated, but also wanting to check on people and what do people need in the community. And it's a beautiful offering. And people have been doing that for a long, long time as an expression of care, and recognizing that all of our needs are not met in the same way, and that these systems get in the way of taking care of us, depending on the identities we embody. And so I think this moment is inviting us into a space of remembering that we are related, connected to one another, and that we need to care for each other and the planet. It's not just about humans, so, and the planet. In Skill and Action, my first book, at the end, I wrote, "The world's on fire," and I meant it in all of the ways. And I've said that for years and years. And the world literally is. North Carolina has a mountain on fire right now. We don't have wildfires here. I mean, we've had two other ones that I can remember, you know, but this mountain that I used to go to a lot has been burning since Sunday. And which is, it's like the environment, the world is saying, pay attention, people,
Mhm.
right? People protesting in the streets, pay attention. Um, People who are navigating COVID, dealing with it, have lost a loved one or trying to figure out what's going on, right? COVID saying, pay attention, people, what are you doing to each other? Climate change is, I mean, so many things are saying, move, y'all. Like, do something different or look at what you've been doing. Do you want to keep doing it? This is how I understand it. Like, and I also am clear we're here on purpose. I don't know everyone's purpose, but I think we're here on purpose at this time. Like, I know I'm supposed to be alive at this time. I just talked to my mom. We were both talking about it. Like, we're supposed to be alive at this moment in time to move through this and to figure out what we want to do, not for us, our individual gain, but for the collective. And
And
I'm sure that's why I came in. And I think we're all being asked this question of how can we respond to what's going on right now? What is our duty or dharma? What is our role right now? Knowing that that could evolve over time. I think people have to slow down enough to hear the calling that's coming from all these different places that is asking us to rise up in the different ways we need to rise up to change the trajectory of where we're headed. So I think it's back to practice and mindfulness and slowing down enough to feel into what's going on. And once we feel into it, I think that will remind us that we're here on purpose and that we're being called into something um, sort of bigger for each other.
that's a powerful antidote to feeling powerless. So many
Hmm.
people feel like I can't do anything. It's overwhelming. And that's really not true. It's
Right.
really not true. Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm.
And the world wants it. Like, I mean, I say the world, but and systems of oppression want us to feel overwhelmed so we do not do anything and to feel powerless and certainly do things that take away power. Right. And still in that, even, I think about this in my Black body in a white supremacy culture. I understand that like there is something I can do, right? Even though power is being taken away all the time based on race, not based on other identities, really, but I'm a cisgender female, so of course the patriarchy as well. But like I have a lot of privileged identities, and I understand that because of that power, social power and institutional power, I'm called into doing something for people who actually have less power than I do, but doing that in community and relationship. So I know people feel powerless, and I don't think we are. I know we're not, and it's a process to figure out what we are meant to do. And we're going to make a lot of mistakes along the way, and it's going to be messy. But the world is already a mess, so it's like it's going to be messy, and we're just like acknowledging the mess and then figuring out what do we want to do with this mess that we're in right now.
So true. So
Mhm.
can you say a little bit about how people can get a hold of you, your website, your books, the work you do, your podcast? Where would you direct people to start? To your website?
Yeah, my website, which is michellecjohnson.com, and people can find out about all the workshops. There's a link to the books. There's a Finding Refuge website and Skill and Action website, but they link from Michelle C. Johnson workshops, retreats. I have a lot of different offerings. The podcast as well, which is called Finding Refuge, and it's in its second season. That's a resource. I did some interviews before COVID about healing and community and collective grief and liberation. And then I did some more when COVID began because I was like, oh, this is what I was talking about. And I didn't know COVID was going to happen. And so there are 30 interviews that are on YouTube that people can access from many different perspectives and identities and people talking about the connection between grief and liberation. So that's a good resource as well.
Hmm. Well, thank you so much for meeting with me and for this discussion. It's been great to talk with you, and I really appreciate you being part of the summit.
Thank you so much for inviting me. It's good to connect with you in this way.
This is Lynn Fraser with the Radical Recovery Summit. We have an exciting lineup for our fifth annual, including Dr. Gabor Maté as our keynote speaker. Head on over to radicalrecoverysummit.com to learn more and watch the interviews.